for staying as long as you have today. And we have a really interesting panel here today. So look, for those of you who haven't seen me in previous panels, I feel like Troy McClure here. My name is Michael Meagher. I am a director here at the Open Ireland Network. I've been involved in an open science and open source project that was funded by NORF, who you'll hear about from Michelle. It's been really focused on building a framework for managing open source within universities. So I suppose just to kind of set some of the context, when we looked at the proposal around this, it kind of came from two directions. One, the TTOs, for those of you who don't know, TTOs are tech transfer officers within universities. We're really trying to struggle to come to terms in terms of how do we actually manage open source. It's out in the wild. Can we put some guardrails around it? You know, what do we do? This stuff is, and you know, can we let it out? Are there new ways of doing things? So it was a very interesting kind of proposal to put into play, and then we tied that down in terms of what we saw were gaps as well within the university around it. Again, some of the things that were missing from an open science perspective. And what we found was that there was no frameworks in place or guides around how open source should be done, who's responsible for it, how would you even start. So the MOSI project came out of that, and I suppose the first iteration, I always say it's the first iteration, because we always look for feedback as part of it. We've actually, similar to the Turing way, we've created an open document as part of it. It's published in Sonodo, geez, I always get that one wrong. I get into Zelda, Warrior Princess and everything. And yes, so it's published in Sonodo, and it's available on GitHub as well to take feedback as part of that. So we put a very comprehensive guide in place. It's there to kind of advise and support VPs of research, again, TTOs, again, research officers, and to try and bring that community together and say there's an alternative pathway. It's not one or the other when we think about proprietary licensing and open source, and how do we actually come together to coalesce and actually build upon some of the amazing work that's out there, and actually open up different and new collaboration opportunities as well. We heard about the work that you were doing this morning, Marie, as well, so that was fantastic. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to Michelle to introduce herself and talk about the work of NORF.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for everyone who's managed to stay in the room until 5:15 now at this stage.
Yeah, don't be running out the door yet, folks.
So my name is Michelle Doran, and I'm the National Open Research Coordinator. I work for an entity, let's call it. I think I've successfully made that, everyone that's managed to make that noise for whatever reason, called the National Open Research Forum, which is in a sort of Russian doll of organisations. So the National Open Research Forum is supported by the Digital Repository of Ireland, which is based in the Royal Irish Academy. It's a Government of Ireland initiative, supported by the Department of Further Higher Education, and it's funded by the Higher Education Authority. So I think that's all of the organisations name checked. And so Malvika was introduced to open research, which is, I suppose, how we refer to it on a national level. It's also referred to, I think, more commonly as open science, but it's also referred to, I think you said, open practices and also open scholarship. And open research includes a number of practices, including, this should roll off with my tongue, open research data, open educational resources, open source software and tools, of course, and alternative approaches to research evaluation and research metrics, and they're just to keep a few examples of the practices. But most importantly, those practices aren't means in and of to ends in and of themselves, but rather they contribute to the broader goal of a more transparent, trustworthy and equitable global research system or knowledge commons. And so for those of you who are in the room, this morning you would have heard Omar speak about open source software for the Sustainable Development Goals, but there are similar tracks for open research and open data in terms of contributing to the successful achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So Ireland's response then to this kind of global scientific movement was the establishment of the National Open Research Forum in 2017. And since then, the structure and the function of NORF has evolved. In 2019, the forum, I should say when it was established, constituted between 80 and 90 experts in the various areas of open science. So in 2019, they published the framework for a transition to an open science environment, 2000 and 2021. They published the Open Research Landscape Report, and those two documents were formative documents in the 2022 publication of our National Action Plan for Open Research, which is essentially, I suppose, it's more than a roadmap, it is an action plan. It is how we aim to have a fully embedded, a research ecosystem that has open research fully embedded in it by 2030. So the role of NORF as it currently stands is to oversee the coordination of that and implementation of that National Action Plan for Open Research. And 2025 is a review year for that National Action Plan to assess where we are in terms of its implementation, where we are, I suppose, ticking the boxes, but also where we need to maybe speed up or incorporate emerging themes into those actions. And we also then manage a fund that funds, well, some of them have finished, but there were 9 what are called priority action projects. So these are projects that were identified in the National Action Plan for Open Research as being fundamental to increasing national capacity in open research. So examples of those, they are both infrastructure in the digital infrastructure sense, but also social infrastructure. So an example of the former would be our National Open Access Monitor, which is assessing Ireland's, I suppose, it's tricky because it's not entirely representative because of licensing at the moment, but the percentage of which our research publications are available in open access. And then an example of the social infrastructure would be the Sunry National Data Stewardship Network. And then we also funded in 2023 9 what we called open research stimulus projects, which we're looking at emerging themes in open research. So I've heard a couple of times today people refer to things in AI years. So 3 years ago is a long time in AI years, and it's similarly a long time ago in, I suppose, open research and open science. So it's making sure that our plan is staying up to date and keeping an eye on these emerging themes. So I thought it was really interesting that Malvika said that open source inspired open science, because then we, I suppose, funded the Motsai project viewing open source as an emerging theme within science. So maybe things are coming full circle again. So.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. As part of the kind of NORF community, we do get together from time to time, and there is this. Is that open source stuff not already done then? And you know, what's your relationship between open source and open science as part of it? So I think we still even have a bit of work to do there to understand each other and actually just come together. And I think that's some of the thing where the coders and the techies and the scientists need to kind of merge together. But again, it's a great learning, and it's sometimes there's shared values certainly throughout it. There are some differences, and there's some different things that we have to do for open source within the open science space, but then how do we tie all that back together? How do we just make it into one umbrella? And I think that's the beauty of NORF, is that we're starting those conversations, and even what Malvika is doing with the Turing way as well. How do we bring everyone together into the umbrella of openness? So, thank you, Michelle. I might skip you, Malvika, for a moment, because I'll give you a break. And I'll move you on to Noel O'Connor. Noel, do you want to give a bit of people background on who you are?
Sure, thanks Michael. So I'm Noel O'Connor. I'm a professor in the School of Electronic Engineering at Dublin City University, but actually for the last 5 years I've been seconded out of that role to lead the National Research Centre for Data Analytics, funded by Research Ireland, which is the new national funding agency for basic and applied research. We're the largest of the research centres, funded by Research Ireland, and we're aligned with all things to do with data analytics, data governance, data engineering, and of course machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we're not just a bunch of computer scientists or engineers, we also work across disciplines, so we look at how these technologies can be applied for societal benefit and for economic benefit in a variety of different domains. We were established 11 years ago with a very large investment from the Irish taxpayer, which was renewed 5 years into our lifetime as kind of an endorsement, I suppose, of the work that we were doing. What that type of investment buys for a country the size of Ireland is a genuinely national endeavour that is inclusive, that brings together all the institutions in Ireland and anybody who wants to be part of the centre. So uniquely in an Irish context, we're co-led by multiple universities, which is unusual probably globally as well, because universities like to own things and lead things, but it was found that, it was decided that it was in the national interest of an endeavour like Insight would be co-led by 4 universities, 2 in Dublin, 1 in the south of Ireland and 1 in the west of Ireland, and then all of the other universities are free to participate as partner organisations. So we bring together the strengths from across the research and academic ecosystem. We mobilise over 1,000 researchers right across the country, and our primary output is scientific excellence, and we are peer reviewed every couple of years on that by international peer review conducted by Research Ireland. So it's the usual things you expect from academics, papers and PhDs and so on. But our second raison d'etre and our requirement from our funding agency is to interact with industry, right? To collaborate with multinationals, with small companies, to develop to co-design new research methodologies, new algorithms, new approaches, and so on and so forth. And the way that actually works is that the original investment is only actually unlocked by virtue of those collaborations, right? So we have this kind of weird tension within the centre, whereby we are set up to do fundamental, basic, cutting-edge, world-class science, but at the same time we're required to work in very applied domains with companies large and small on projects that very often may not actually result in publications. Okay, so for us over the last few years it's been a really interesting journey to understand how to make that work. We kind of started off with 2 worlds. There was scientists one day doing fundamental research that they would publish based on core funding, and then the next day they're working in collaboration with a company where the IP was locked down and they couldn't talk about it in some cases, to a model now where most of our industry partners, and we have over 170 over the course of the centre, understand that there's a middle ground there somewhere. And the middle ground really is to understand that you can do collaborative research between industry and academia, and you can bridge those two worlds, right? Where you can still protect your intellectual property for the economic payback for the original investment for the company, but you can also then, on foot of that, make the research accessible and open via publications, via releasing source code, and so on and so forth. And we've got some fantastic examples of success in that regard within the centre, which I can speak to if you like. But
just to hold it there now, because I think that's really interesting, right? So, you know, there seems to be, especially from what I've heard, right, so maybe you can share this with everyone else, is the nature and the changing of those relationships as well, and who's pushing those requirements. Is it you? Is it industry? You know, and why are they doing it?
Yeah, interestingly, it's normally industry, right? Sorry, it happens because industry realised the benefits of this. The academics are always pushing it, right, from the very word go, let's be honest, right? But what we've noticed, particularly with our longer term engagements with industry partners, is that there's a kind of a dawning of understanding with the industry partners over time, where they realise that actually having co-authored publications in high impact journals or conferences is beneficial to them. Getting the models or the knowledge graphs or the code out there is good for them as well. So they understand that actually there's different ways to promote what they're doing, like beyond the sales, traditional sales marketing route based on locked down proprietary IP. And a good example of that is Fidelity Investments, based in Galway. That's where their Irish HQ is based. We've been working with Fidelity Investments now for over 5 years on multiple projects. It's a multi-million investment from Fidelity Investments. And interestingly, 5 years ago, that started off with that very traditional approach of, we want to fund you to do research that will generate interesting and valuable intellectual property for us. And publications are off the table, and you can't even tell people you're working with us, right? But over the course of the 5 years, as we built that relationship, right, as we built a community actually between their engineers and our researchers, there was a level of trust that built up, endorsed by the quality of the work, where now, after 5 years, we have multiple co-authored publications, we've released code, some of the academics are named on patents, which is great for them, for their CV, for their career, for their promotion prospects. So it's a great model, I think, of how over time industry realised, this actually makes economic sense, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting where, again, we go back to this idea, we've probably heard it many times today, it's open where possible, closed where necessary, but we're seeing more moving to this open. And I think the interesting thing about the Fidelity story is, again, what's happening even in fintech, right? So you've got FinOps that's tied into there. That whole industry, which you would have thought was completely terrifying of security issues, sharing issues, competitive advantage, is actually very collaborative. They have similar problems, they come together to solve similar problems for the industry, and they share amongst that community as well. And I think that's really, really interesting. And it's a great example that we hear as part of that. Just the Turing way. So, which is another fabulous story about that, and I think what we're seeing now as well is spin-outs from that, and actually collaborations with SMEs and other organisations as part of it. And I think there's a lot where we can learn from that, where it started as a small community and started to build out, similar to what Noel has done and the work as well what Prof is doing. Where do you think we could go? How do you think we can scale this? There seems to be an appetite of more things in the open. So where do we scale?
Yeah. So those who are not in the room, I am a senior researcher at the Turing Institute, where I focus on open research and community building. And the project that I was talking about, which is one of the primary projects that I've worked on in the last 5 years, called the Turing Way, which is a community-led guide on data science. And when we call it guide, it kind of guilts me into acknowledging it's a book, but actually the most important part is what you're saying is how can we bring these people together on their shared interests and try to get them to solve the problem that they need to address. Currently we're collecting a lot of testimonials from these people, and some of the testimonials are that we can point to this resource in our application or proposal or in our institute, and people trust that because these resources are built by international community, the practices are very high quality and reusable. So they don't have to rewrite these. I think our academic articles are very repetition. In every article you have to describe what everything is, and you would see that the Turing Way is cited in a lot of papers for that particular reason, is that these definitions are coming from the Turing Way. So the question around scaling, so we did start with very small, 10 people, and now we are 500 people who have contributed to the book, about 1,000 people who are in the Slack space, and we also have, I won't say there's a pressure, but there is an internal understanding that currently it's supported by one institution, and all of these community members come from very different institutions. And also I think maybe something that I often question in conversations about open science, when we talk about this global effort of bringing international community together, and then suddenly the conversation moves to, but the UK government is paying for this, so you have to kind of justify why it's good for a UK audience, or why it's good for Irish government or Irish community. And I think this conversation also happened that we need to focus on what skill gap what knowledge gap are we trying to address? How do we get this community to address that in a way that actually serves the purpose? And it's not so much about does it only serve the UK community, because we could never monitor that. So scaling is hard, but one thing that we have been very clear about, that we don't mind if people fork the Turing way, take everything, create a new resource that they want. It's just they need to understand that maintenance of any resource is very hard. So if you fork the Turing way, it means that you need to build another community to maintain it, and it's probably not really good in the long term. So what we're trying to do is to, rather than scaling in the unsustainable way, we're asking institutions to commit to supporting their employees to work on the Turing way during their work hour, in a way that they can justify that these resources are going back to my institution and these are important. Or the learnings that we are getting here, because this is a very agile open source community, we can bring those experiences back to our community. So for example, NHSR is our community of people who are working in NHS. And a lot of time NHS works with proprietary databases and technology, and they have API, so they can build these R and Python code to close the loops between two technology. And this group of people are utilizing the Turing way to, inform how to build these technology that are fair, interoperable, reusable, understandable, can make sense in terms of maintenance. So scaling for me looks like not just about expanding the Turing way, but inspiring other projects where the practices that we're building are applicable and that people can sustain their own communities in that sense.
That's great.
Yeah, thanks, Malvika. I think one of the things that came across to me, and of course, like all great ideas, it's blindingly obvious after you hear it, was the fact that open source, open science is at its heart about inclusivity and accessibility, right? And that's what research should be at the end of the day, not least because we're funded by the taxpayer, right? So it should be open to everybody in society. And perhaps that is a lever that we could use within institutions to say, invest in this, because by investing in this, you're also investing or supporting or bolstering your existing equality, diversity, inclusion mission, for example, for the university, right? And I think that's a very powerful argument to actually make, that takes it away from, oh, it's a bunch of techies who are correcting links and writing code and so on. It actually is, at the end of the day, about inclusivity.
Yeah, can I just comment on that? We literally got one data scientist writing to us saying that it's so great to be recognized, It's great to be seen, Like their work is valued so much because we recognize them as community builder, not just person fixing the link. And we recognize all of these work. And I think that is not always possible in academia. We can't really recognize and incentivize these like menial, tiny jobs, whereas all of these are valued so highly in the communities like in the open source, because we know that someone really spent their time, that they didn't have to. But also, maybe a bit controversial, EDI, we're grateful that we're in Europe where EDI is still important to this day, because it's very difficult for us to have this conversation while our community members in their own countries have their programs on EDI under threat.
So I'm going to remain in the research space, I suppose, and just building on the being in Europe and the value proposition. You can't underestimate the importance of our involvement in Europe and all of the various, I suppose, legislative obligations that places on us, and then also in terms of the common European knowledge space and European research funding. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of these open research practices are mandated to avail of European research funding. So that in and of itself is part of that value proposition, at least in a university research setting, is that in order to avail of this, billion euro pot of research funding, we must be able to demonstrate that we can implement these open research practices.
Yeah, and it kind of leads me on to my next kind of track on this, and it's really interesting to get all of your thoughts on the various different ways this comes into play. So, Malvika, you talked about sustainability and funding. That's a key core bit, and again, you've scaled something community-based this really, really well. Michelle, you're leading up NORF. NORF's done some amazing seed funding into a couple of really core initiatives, and you've started some really positive work in the Irish ecosystem and collaborated really well from a European context as well. And I know you're going into a review right now. So I've kind of two questions. First question, just for you, is what have we learned in that period of time, and then what do we need to do next? And then I'll go on to what's missing. Right? So what do we?
So my very political answer is I don't want to preempt the results of the review just yet.
But be an ecumenical
precisely. But I think it's just reflecting on the project's process is that a project approach to certain things isn't always appropriate. And from a particularly kind of that core infrastructural perspective, I recognise that pilots are important, but it's to make that transition then from a pilot to that sustainable core infrastructure piece is difficult, right? So that's a very maybe practical, how do you get from pilot to not project, but something that's kind of more central. And then open research, open science, it's not new, you know, but we're still really grappling with that culture change that you referred to earlier on as well. So how do we incentivize these practices? How do we institutionalize the practices as well? So it's not just about the individual, but rather about the institution. And I think we're a good ways down that road, but I'm not sure that we've fully answered the question yet.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. Sorry, Martina, I'll go to the audience in a few minutes. So, but I do think it's well, we're at a stage now where, and I think you and I talked about this off microphone, which was about there's so many people who are doing best efforts, right? There's a fantastic community that's here. We've amazing open source, you know, advocates and people who are contributing to open source, but they can only go so far. We've heard this before from even the people who are putting in extra hours to try and get this going and get it moving. People believe in it, and we heard the same from Malvika as well in terms of that initial body started to grow, and you've got the coalition of the willing effectively to make it further. And I suppose I think we're at a precipice where you need to think about how do we institutionalize some of these things. So these are, to me, sometimes now, because we're mainstream, how does this become part of core infrastructure? Well, I don't mean that as physical infrastructure, but as services, as support, you know, similar to sources that are in the library. The library's taken up an awful lot of slack in relation to open science over the years as part of that. They do an amazing job, but then it's just getting bigger and bigger, and as you say, there's legislation now, there's funding and requirements that work has to be done a certain way. It feels like we need to transition to something. There's a skills piece that goes into that as well. There's an evolution part, and I really want to kind of understand those learnings, you know, now, and when we think about what we need to do going forward, what do we need to do at a national level? What would be your ask? Without getting too political. Yeah.
You get me fired.
This is being recorded.
So my ask in terms of my ask of who, I suppose, would be how I would respond to that question, because it's been for context, my background is in research, humanities research specifically. So the transition, I suppose, to NORF it's been a learning curve, because in academia you look no more than here, I suppose. You're speaking to people that, you know, we exist in that world of publish or perish. And then you move outside of it and you kind of see all the different cogs that are making this academic wheel spin. So when you say, what's my ask? There are so many different components of which I would ask many things of. That's a very again, diplomatic way of answering the question, but ask of who, I suppose, is...
Well, I suppose if I'm going to put you on the spot now, okay? So now that you have been under enough pressure, I'll take it up a notch. But I suppose, what have we learned? What's needed? Is it more of the same? Is it, now is it a pivotal moment to actually change and actually do investment? I know at the last NORF conversation we were talking about the national infrastructure funding, and we haven't had a large one of those across the universities probably in about 15 years, where we've built buildings and some significant infrastructure updates. I suppose what I was thinking was that we're at a point of pivotal services that need to transition as part of this in order to embrace the future, and also legislation that's coming across from Europe as well. How do we react now, and how do we best prepare? And if we were thinking about what our ask is, and I think it's okay to dream. There's a sense of dreaming and there's a sense of asking and a sense of being refused as well. So I think it's always okay to ask. All you can say, as my mother would say, is no, which she said a lot of. But I think that's the onus is on us to kind of say, okay, we do have these gaps, and this is what we do need, and this is what will be ideal. Not ideal world, what would it be? No, I'm going to give that to you because you had.
Yeah.
I'll give you a breather, Michelle.
I will come back to it if that's okay. No.
Yeah, because I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to answer the question that wasn't asked. But no, it actually speaks to, I suppose, what's missing. And one thing that I have noticed is training and upskilling of PhD researchers is really, really important here. And I think we've made some inroads into that with the introduction of the cohort-based PhD education models based upon best practice in the UK. There's through the Centres for Doctoral Training, and that gives you an opportunity to upskill an entire cohort of PhD students on skills they wouldn't necessarily get through the old model, right? So you can take them out of their master acolyte, Padawan, Jedi Master relationship they have with their supervisor, and you can start to train them on things like project management or presentation skills. And open science and open source should be one of those skills that we are teaching them there as well, right? Because they don't know, possibly, but they will end up using it at some point in their research career, because who knows where the various different disciplines will go. Over the last 5 years alone in the field of computer vision, for example, it's now effectively impossible to get your paper published unless you make the code available so people can rerun your models and reproduce your results, right? So you have a whole generation of PhD students who are releasing code with their papers who never received any formal training on what it means to open source your code. So I think there's something there that's missing, quite honestly, and it could be better represented and built into the institutional structured pathways for PhDs, I think.
Can I share some thoughts and opinions? Well, I'll share some concrete example and I'll give you more time to think about it, how to be diplomatic. So there are, I definitely agree on Center of Doctoral Training is really great because we get to teach them about open science, reproducibility, and so on. And there is something called enrichment scheme that we have at the Turing, where any PhD student who's interested in working with specific groups working in data science AI can spend about 9 months of their PhD program where they're given stipend and support. And it has been really interesting to see their growth in a different environment that is not their own previous lab, because they know it's very short period, they have to make best of it, they are networking is incentivized, they are talking to each other. So cohort-based model definitely works a lot well in upskilling these people. And the second one is programs like Software Sustainability Institute Fellowship. These fellowships are available not just for people who see themselves as academic or researcher, but people like research engineers, data stewards, data wranglers, community managers. So me and my colleague Emma Karoum, we did a research on what are the diversified roles look like in the modern data science. We cannot rely on PhDs and postdocs to do all the things. We need to specialize people on the things that's needed in data science. We need to build team science mentality so people can specialize in data engineering or community management or data ethics or whatever that might be. So definitely building a fellowship program where these kind of specialization is promoted and incentivized. And SSI doesn't offer a lot of money. They offer about £4,000 for a year and a half. But that money is available for these people to go to a conference that their university wouldn't pay for, or organize an event that their university doesn't have money for. And it really gives us agency for something that we believe in and something this organization certainly believes in, and it becomes a thing. I'm also attending a lot of conferences. This is my last one. So I was in Software Heritage Summit, where they have built this national infrastructure in Paris, in France, for anybody in France, but also anywhere in Europe, to be able to use this cloud infrastructure where they have huge data repository. And these data repositories where they're also inviting fellows to come in and build technology inside that, and open source technology. So these data are from heritage, from health, or whatever can be open data, and anybody who's interested in can apply to become a fellow, and if they get selected, they are given access to this data repository where they can build AI technology to do things that they wouldn't have otherwise access to if they don't have this data. So that kind of shared infrastructure, and although as I said it's France, they really promote anybody from across the Europe, from outside Europe, to use this infrastructure. So that shared infrastructure is really, really great. Another are obviously policies that we are hearing from Sachiko. They did open source policy summit where they are talking about how do we leverage these policies that are already there as a legal term, but universities and government are not really investing on it, and at some point they will have to. So how can parliament spend money? Like, for example, Germany has something called Sovereignty Fund. They have spent 13 million in the last 2 or 3 years to support open source as a public good. And you do need to ask your government to spend money on infrastructure that is important for your own economy. And funding is at the end, at the core of it all. So I think you have enough time.
You better say something really controversial.
So I have thought of an ask that I would ask of all of the cogs that are involved. So I certainly wouldn't deny the need for significant capital investment in research infrastructure. So that's open research infrastructure and research infrastructure more broadly speaking. However, what I would say to, as I said, all of the cogs, all of the individuals, institutions, organisations, policymakers involved is, can we please start talking to one another? Because it's beyond frustrating to see where, well, that community of practice is the same of that community of practice, or you don't need a community of practice, there's already one happening over here. And I'm saying community of practice because I don't fund community practices. If I said project, I'd probably get myself shot. But it applies there too. And then also with policies. And again, just from my perspective, we have, research integrity, open research, like evidence-based public policy, open access agendas. I'm not saying they're the same thing, but there's significant overlap there, and a sharing of resources as opposed to this kind of grab, because as Noel said, universities, institutions, they don't like to share things, they don't like to share resources, but we kind of need to. So that's my ask of everyone, but also a lot of money, please.
Yes. No, I think that's a very poignant thing to end on, because I think we do need to build on the strengths of others, and actually the whole idea of openness is actually a key thing. I would agree with you. We have policies, they need to change, they need to be updated. We can do that together, and I think collaboratively there is so much crossover. We see it in NORF, we see it in so many other things as well. So we're nearly wrapping up, folks. There's a couple of questions. I know Martina, you had one as well. So I'm going to give it to the floor. So Martina, you. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for a fantastic day, by the way. This is a kind of a comment rather than a question. I feel like I need to have Michelle dig herself out of that big hole that you put her into. Sorry, I'm from HERO, by the way, the National Research Centre for Software. And I want to talk specifically about the NORF investment date and the difference that it has actually made to HERO. And we were involved in a phase 1 project, or stream 1 project, around tooling up skill sets for open science practices, laid out in Luke. And then we had the Mossy project, which Michael and Noel's group were involved in as well. That has made a huge difference to us to be more competitive in Europe, and we are now looking to internationalise the work that we've done in those 2 projects. So that could be a key message back. We're looking
come back to you
us-
for that message.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because we have already now targeted international funds, some European, some US-based funds, because there is actually a lot of funding out there, particularly for open source software stuff in the States. And because of the capacity that we were allowed to build up, like, we didn't get a huge amount of money, but what it did was it brought the communities together. Like, academics were probably working in academic circles, but we weren't interacting with the TTOs, with the libraries, with the government sector. And NORF has allowed us, the NORF funding has allowed us to do that. And I just want to say that we have now built capacity, and we're able to look towards Europe and to internationalise larger projects. And we now have some kudos, we have a bit of track record, we've been able to have publications in the area, we have outputs, we have our frameworks, you know, so it's given us, it's allowed us to build both capacity and outputs, and it's been really significant. So that's something that maybe you could say to reviewers.
Thank you very much. That's great to hear.
I might just pass it to Jenny there.
Oh
behind you.
yeah, Jenny.
Just you've got me thinking when you were asking about what's missing, and I think from my perspective, Jenny O'Neill from HANet, the buy-in from senior leadership is still, from my perspective, very missing and very lacking, and what we do get is very just kind of, oh yeah, you go and do that, and here's a tiny bit of money, and you know, you just have to make do with what's there. So I would like to see greater buy-in from senior leadership, and also greater investment in infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean the technical infrastructure, but also the human infrastructure, the people who have the skills and the expertise to support the researchers throughout the research life cycle. And I think that's true for open source as well as for open research.
Malcolm.
Hi, I'm Malcolm, I'm a lawyer. Loads of KTOs.
Everyone leave.
Sorry, I work with loads of KTOs, and I live in Spain, and maybe we're a bit of old-fashioned there. University level research just measured in terms of patents and royalties. So if you go the open source way, which I fully believe in, because I've been in it for the last 25 years, we're finding a lot of difficulties getting traction from, as you said, the guys up there, because the university is being measured in something that actually is not bringing the impact. So, and I know that the whole concept of impact is trying to be changed. I don't know if you have where it is at the moment. Is Aaron got some non-royalty stroke patent measurement of impact that you can understand how much value is being brought by the open science, open research, and open source?
I can answer that one. So the answer is no. So we don't have proper kind of KPIs in relation to the open source of software. So there's a lot of open source software, but it's not measured. Yeah. And I suppose it's interesting. I know Malcolm's done an awful lot of work with like Irish TTOs and actually training and stuff like that, or on some of the kind of legal obligations, or coach them whatever way you want to classify it. But again, there is an interest in this space, and I suppose there's certain things that we look for. Like when you have a metric, and I've worked in the commercial sector, you go after the metric, right? If you're a sales guy, you go after the sales targets. If you're a marketing person, you go after the KPIs, whatever that may be. And I think we probably need to start to look at some of the supporting elements, those KPIs, that help shift behaviour and actually reward outputs. And again, some of the learnings that we would have taken from Mossy, for example, we would have done a huge amount of feedback from researchers right the way across Ireland as part of it. And a lot of them involved in open science and open research. And even at a simple level of awards, how do they get recognised? So the work that they do, the contributions that they make, how does it support even their academic progression and stuff like that? So I think there's a huge amount of learnings to do, and I think there's a lot of simple things Michelle says, that we can do and implement, that actually wouldn't cost an awful lot, but actually would reward and recognise some of the work that needs to be done. And again, I think a lot of the pull and push is actually coming from the TTO, isn't the research office, is going to say, we need to change this. And then, like I spoke to Enterprise Ireland this morning, just on that point, it's going to say, well, actually, that's interesting. Okay, we need to listen to that. We need to think about how we need to look at those outputs differently. And again, that's not everything needs to be open source. Not everything needs to be open science. And again, I think it's not a religious movement. And again, I think that's the things that frighten people. And I think we need to kind of say, well, there's reasons why we don't do it, and there's reasons why we do, and these are the reasons that we tend to work on. There's an open framework, and let's work in that framework. Are you happy to work in that framework? And that's the basis of any kind of collaboration and negotiation. And again, Noel, you started off, and I was kind of, no, none of that stuff. And it's slowly opening and it's evolving. I think evolution is the key.
Maybe just, it's a great question, Malcolm, by the way, right? I think from a very positive perspective nationally, the funding agency I work most with has gone completely away from those types of metrics, right? And it's more about impact and describe and how you define impact, right? So in our annual progress reports and our reviews, we don't talk about royalty, we don't talk about licenses, we talk about a particular company is now more competitive. They're a small company in terms of being able to access external markets by virtue of working with us, okay? Or we've helped anchor a multinational here in Ireland by virtue of that collaboration. So it's a way of trying to explain the value of what we're doing with it without getting into very blunt instruments like royalties and licenses, which, let's be honest, don't really make a lot of money for Irish universities, no matter how big those numbers are.
So I suppose just to plug a number of the NORF funded projects. So you mentioned earlier about open science training, for example. So we have a Tropic project, which is building an open science training program at the moment, and that should be available later in the year as an open educational resource. And they are running a number of the trainers, summer and winter schools as well. On the question, I suppose, then of metrics, we have a project that's looking at incentivising open research practices, and that won't be completed until towards the end of 2026. But that's a multi-university project, so they're developing a framework for incentivising open research practices. And then just the summary project, which Jenny is involved in, is also looking at, I suppose, the training needs for research data steward professionals as well. So that's, I suppose, a lot of ongoing work, but it's on the radar, maybe is the best way of describing it at the moment. So.
I'm going to call time there, folks, because we're nearly 5:30, so we're a little bit over. So just to kind of wrap up, I just want to thank all our panelists today. It's been a great conversation. I've had fun talking to you all in relation to this. Thank you all for coming to this session. Thank you all for coming to this summit. If you want to stay in contact with us, we've got QR codes outside. If you want some of the publications that we've done, whether it's the Mossy report, the SkillsNet report that's come into play, scan them, download them, take a look at them. We'd love your feedback in relation to them. But please do stay connected. So register, stay connected. We'll have more events like this. We have another one planned coming forward. You will get the slides, yeah. So you'll get slides and you'll get videos as well. So some of them will be published as part of it. So we won't publish everything. It's just too much content to get out there. We will try and publish the slides as well as part of that.